And it was really interesting because if you went to the catalogues in all the estate libraries and looked under migrant for memoirs, it brought up non-English speaking migrant memoirs. It didn't bring up the English or the British because it was sort of implicitly assumed they weren't migrants.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. A Jimmy Grant, an immigrant, a pomegranate, a pom. Such was the evolution of Australian slang in the 19th and early 20th century. Contrary to popular belief, POM was not just an acronym for Prisoner of Mother England. During World War II, Australia's security and economic situation was so dire that the government implemented an assisted passage scheme to bring out a Briton. These migrants were called the 10 Pound Poms, paying just £10 to migrate to Australia on condition they stay for a minimum of 2 years. But what were their experiences of migration to Australia really like? Joining me today on Afternoon Light to discuss the 10 Pound Poms is Alistair Thomson, an Emeritus Professor of History at Monash University. Welcome, Alistair.
Great. Thanks, Georgina, for having me.
It's great to have you on. So, 10 Pound Pom, we all know it. We all know lots of 10 Pound Poms, although they're probably getting a bit long in the tooth these days. Tell me about the 10 Pound Pom scheme.
So, as you said, it was a scheme that was devised initially in collaboration between the two governments, Britain and Australia. At the end of the war, Australia, as you know, desperately realised that it needed to complete reconstruction industrially and it needed a more robust population base for security purposes. And Arthur Calwell and others persuaded the Australian people that a major migration scheme was necessary. And because of the long history of white Australia and Australian racism, reassured the Australian public that this would be a British migration. They were pretty careful with what they said. At one point, I think Calwell or someone said 1 in 10 might not be. But actually what happens, as we know, is that the displaced people, the first big wave of migrants who come to Australia as part of our responsibility to the United Nations, which Australia had been a signatory to. But pretty quickly, from the late 1940s, the 10 Pound Passage Scheme takes off, but starting off with British ex-servicemen and their families and then spreading more widely. And eventually it was £10 and kids went free. Eventually it became $10 and then eventually $20 at one point. But it was universally known as the 10 Pound Scheme, and they were the 10 Pound Poms. And, you know, probably 1.5 million, depends whether you count the Irish in it or not, but a really significant number came to Australia between the late 40s and the mid-70s. In that period, the British were always the largest single country of intake to Australia, always more than the Greeks, the Italians and so on. But you'd have to say that in terms of its sort of social and cultural impact on Australia, post-war non-English speaking migration had the biggest social and cultural impact, but they weren't necessarily the most numerous. The British were hugely numerous, but because both in Australia and in Britain, everybody assumed that Australia was just like Britain, but with sun, and that Australian culture would be comfortable and familiar. It was assumed that the British migrants would fit in easily and be pretty well assimilated, if you like, and invisible. And indeed, the subtitle of our book was The Invisible Migrants, because in a way they were harder to spot. That wasn't actually the case because they became pretty noisy when they got here in a range of different ways, and their accents could be heard and known, but they didn't have the same sort of political impact that non-English speaking migrants or cultural impact had. But they were very numerous, and just to take one example, if you look at the Australian music industry in the 50s, 60s and 70s, I just keep discovering names of Johnny Farnham, Jimmy Barnes, most of the Easy Beats, large chunk of AC/DC, and so on and so on. Australian music, I think my colleague Laurie Zion did a thesis about this, about how the migrant hostels in the post-war period, not just British, the Dutch as well, for example, with the Easy Beats, the migrant hostels were this sort of hotbed for bringing new ideas to Australian music and creating a lot of the great sounds that we love.
Yeah. It's interesting, Alistair, that the British government was actually an active participant and, of course, a financial participant in the 10 Pound Pom scheme. So there was that sense they wanted to get people out of Britain as well.
Look, I don't think it was what they wanted to get out, but I think they wanted to support the empire. And it was as much as anything about imperial security that actually, if you have British outposts in Australia and Canada and New Zealand and Southern Africa, both world wars had proved the significance of that for British security. And I think before Suez, that was still a sort of significant mentality in some parts of British government. But pretty soon, Britain realised that it had its own labour crisis and needed to reindustrialise after the war and desperately needed more people, and so began to bring in their own migrants from often former English colonies. And at that point, and I forget the exact year, but eventually the British stopped contributing to the scheme financially and Australia took it over completely. But they never tried to stop it happening and they never opposed it, never tried to prevent people going to Australia. But what was initially a collaboration became primarily an Australian scheme that the British supported, but not financially.
Yeah. You've conducted a lot of interviews. You're an oral historian, first and foremost, so that's, of course, your sort of research methodology. Why is it particularly important to do an oral history of these 10 Pound Poms rather than just go to the archives like most historians do and look at the paperwork?
I mean, generally for migration history, the archives on the whole give you one type of story. They give you the state story and the records of migrants as recorded through the migration system. And so people, if they're filling in visa applications, they say the sort of things to get themselves accepted, and they get photographed in mugshots that make them look like happy migrants, etc. And you get government reports, and incredibly useful. I mean, we needed the statistics, and we needed to understand government policy, and we needed to understand all of that part of it. But if you want to really understand the migrant experience, then you need to listen to the stories of migrants. And that can include life writing as well as oral history. So for this project, I did a sweep through Australian archives looking for British migrant narratives, letters, diaries, memoirs, and so on. What was really interesting, and I was doing
songs, even.
Songs, absolutely. Doing this in the early 2000s, and it was really interesting because if you went to the catalogues in all the estate libraries and looked under migrant for memoirs, it brought up non-English speaking migrant memoirs. It didn't bring up the English or the British because it was sort of implicitly assumed they weren't migrants. And so you had to find those records usually in other ways. So you could easily find Greek, Italian, Turkish, whatever, memoirs, diaries, letters, but you had to search, which tells you something about attitudes and about that invisibility. But there were a lot of self-published memoirs by British migrants. There were some wonderful sets of letters and diaries and so on. So we had all those. But the problem with, letters are an extraordinary source for historical research, and we know about working class experience in the 20th century, mostly because of war and migration, because they encourage people to write letters, and you have those letters. The trouble with migrant letters is they get sent back from Australia to England, and they don't end up in archives, so they're much harder to get and find. What we did find when we started interviewing people is that they had letters. Often if they'd gone back to England or their family had come out to Australia, the letters came together and then they become a family sort of legacy and treasured heirloom. So we discovered a lot of letters, and Jim and I used a lot of letters in the book. But, to be honest, working class migrants are less likely to have recorded their life stories in writing and less likely for those writings to have ended up in archives, and particularly for certain types of groups, then oral history that's why we do oral history, to expand the historical archive, to capture the experiences of individuals and groups of people who are less likely to have recorded their lives and to have those records in archives and to have told the story from their perspective.
Yeah. Before we get on to who were these 10 Pound Poms, because, you're starting to give some hints. They've tended to be working class or ex-servicemen and women and their families. Can you just paint a picture of what Australia in that post-war period, late 40s, was like? Because we look at some of the statistics, it was interestingly largely Australian born. Something like 87% of people were Australian born. And I guess this is sort of feeds into your subtitle of The Invisible Migrant for the 10 Pound Poms, is these 10 Pound Poms were coming out. They were British, but Australians were British subjects. So they sort of saw their identity as British, but they mainly were born here and had actually quite a unique form of identity and nationalism, didn't they?
Yeah. It's a really interesting point. You have to really look at what was Britain like in the late 1940s and what was Australia like in the late 1940s and 50s to understand the experience of these migrants. Britain is war-shattered, economically bankrupt. It's cold and miserable, some of the worst winters, the late 40s. It's a tough place to be. Australia, relatively unscathed, particularly in the southern parts of Australia, by the war, economically picking up, and the economy had been transformed by the war after the Depression, so there were jobs and opportunities. But as you say, it was pretty close to 90% Australian born, and most of the rest were of British or Irish descent. The White Australia policy in 1901 had been very successful in limiting intakes of other groups. There are small groups like Italians in the interwar period who mostly end up in the north, but Australia's pretty careful and pretty cagey about not letting people in, and we saw that in the late 30s with Jewish people trying to get to Australia. Australia was as tough-minded as many countries about that. So yes, in one sense, it's very British. It's fought alongside Britain. A lot of Australian soldiers go to war. They're fighting with Britain, with the Empire. But at the same time, this is a country with 100 plus years of a culture developing independently and distinctly. Accent, language, sport, a whole range of things. And then in the war itself, there's a pretty strong feeling when Churchill tries to stop the Australian troops going back to defend Australia and keep them in the Middle East, and then with the fall of Singapore, there's a beginning of a rupture of that relationship between Australia and Britain. It's overstated. There's a number of really good histories that say that actually in the 40s and 50s and 60s, Australia was desperately wanting to retain the British south of Suez and so on and so forth. And it's not really until Britain joins the European community that there is that really significant split politically and economically. But, culturally, it was a different country. It was a country of Australians who had British origin and who often had British passports and British parents, but who felt themselves to be distinctive. And so when British migrants arrived in the 40s and 50s and 60s, yes, they spoke the language. The political system was reasonably familiar. Ways of working were reasonably familiar. Their working skills were much more likely to be accepted and their qualifications than people from non-English speaking migrant countries. They were favoured in a range of ways, and yet they were also different. And there's a lovely phrase in one interview where a woman describes arriving in Australia as being awfully familiar but terribly strange, which and it's quite hard. And Elizabeth Joly, the novelist who was a British migrant, she also talked about it was these really subtle differences that were significant. And some people say that, I've read and I'm not sure I entirely agree, that migrants from non-English speaking backgrounds in a way had less difficulty psychologically adjusting because they knew it was going to be very different.
Yeah.
And they knew they had to adjust. Whereas the British assumed it would be Britain in the sun. It would all be easy and straightforward. And it wasn't, partly because Australia was culturally distinctive and partly because Australians did tend to give the Poms a bit of a hard time sometimes. Also, because migration is always difficult. Wherever you're coming from and going to, you're rupturing your family connections. You're pulling yourself out of one place, one community, a network of friends and families, and starting again. And that is bloody difficult, whoever you are.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, even my own personal experience I've got a British mother, or English mother, and I've spent some years living in England, and I always surprise myself at how different it is. I think I'm the same. I expect it to just be Australia in the rain in reverse. And no, it's culturally, it is very different and sort of
culturally and environmentally.
And environmentally, of course, but attitudes as well, expectations of social mobility and class, all those things are so different. And, I mean, not to disparage my English cousins and friends and everything, but it's probably the one country where I've felt a little bit of racism, to be honest. Which is against Australians, yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's not across the board at all, but
no.
Yeah.
Yeah, living in England myself for 25 years, and I was in the south of England, I felt two different things. One, I felt it was a class-based thing, that upper-class English people were more likely to be dismissive of an Australian accent. Working-class English people, actually, it liberated you to an extent from some of those class tensions because they saw you as Australian, not as middle-upper class, which I was, but that was hard to tell on first meeting in a British context. So in some ways, the Australian accent was liberating, but you realised that actually you fitted differently into that culture and to that politics and the way in which class is still very powerful in Britain. And that gives you a sense of the difference between the two countries.
Yeah. So tell me, who were these 10 Pound Poms, Alistair?
Look, they varied across time. They initially were primarily working class, skilled working class, taking up the 10 pound passage. They were a mixture of
And was
families.
that quite an amount of money to save up? I mean, was it?
It took a while. It wasn't exorbitant. I mean, it was more in 1947 than it was in 1972, £10 or $20. Big difference. And it made a difference. I can't remember the point where they said kids could go free. That was pretty early on, but that made a difference. So it wasn't particularly a financial barrier, £10, and much less so than if you returned within the 2-year period, you had to then repay the cost of the fares and you had to pay the cost of going back. That was prohibitive, and many British migrants felt trapped who wanted to go home in that first 2 years and just couldn't because they couldn't afford it. But no, the £10 wasn't prohibitive. Working class and skilled, because that's what Australia was looking for. They were looking for people to work in manufacturing industries and on the land and so on. They were looking for skilled workers, although they weren't particularly like now giving points for skills, but they were certainly in their advertising encouraging people like that. And for those people, Australia really did offer an opportunity in terms of jobs, housing, a climate, getting away from war-torn Europe and so on. There's also a layer of skilled professional migrants, not always coming on the £10. A lot of Melbourne University academics, for example, who came from Britain after the war, the university subsidised them rather than the government. So they weren't officially 10 Pound Poms, but they were still post-war British migrants experiencing much of the same. So a lot of it was family. Australia didn't just want workers, they wanted families. They wanted women who were going to have children, and the expectation was that men would work and the women would raise big families and populate the country with Britons. But there were also a lot of young single migrants for whom the £10 passage was a dream, really. It was a cheap working holiday where you had 2 years to sun around, do a bit of work. You didn't have to go and do forced labour on banana plantations like now.
Apparently they don't now. We have a British backpacker who's now no longer a backpacker, but yeah, he was who works here.
I thought it was only in Tasmania. You didn't. Tasmania was regarded as rural, so here in Hobart that was
whole
okay.
State, yeah.
But yeah, so for young singles, it was a great opportunity, and some of them went back, but a lot of them stayed, even though they may have thought they were just going for a couple of years. They got here and liked it. But it is worth noting that the British had a pretty high return rate, upwards of about a quarter.
Oh, right.
Consistently across the period, so much so that in the late 50s, the Australian government, who was paying for the scheme by then, was concerned and did some research, sent a researcher off to Britain and then to come back to Britain on a ship of returning migrants to try and find out why they were returning. So there was a concern that the investment was losing some money because of the return migrants. In fact, of those 25%, which is a high rate, I mean, there is a high rate of return migrants from most countries. A lot of migrants give up and go back. But the British rate was higher than it was for most of the European countries. But when they got to Britain, about half of those returned migrants ended up coming back to Australia.
Interesting. So it was only about 12.5% who permanently
and even coining their own phrase, which was the boomerang migrants, the ones who went backwards and forwards because they really couldn't decide where to settle. Because, you know, for all sorts of reasons, Australia may have been disappointing. It was particularly hard with a young family. You'd lost family support. Older workers sometimes find it difficult to adjust to new circumstances. Homesickness was powerful, et cetera, et cetera. So hence the return. But actually, as someone wisely told me when I came back to Australia after 25 years away, you never really return. You have to start again because you've changed and the country you go back to has changed. And I think that's what happened when a lot of migrants got back, and they got back into the 2 up, 2 down terrace house in Manchester with their extended family all around and thought, crikey, this is claustrophobic, this is cold and miserable. I was earning more in Australia. Okay, we lost a bit, but we gained a lot and went back again. But you couldn't use the scheme twice on the whole, so people then had to save up.
Oh, dear. Tell me, were there any towns or cities that were more represented in the 10 Pound Poms? Like, I mean, was there a big, I guess London, of course, because it's our biggest population.
Yeah, no, there were variations. If you looked at the regions of Britain, and I'm not counting Ireland here because that's a complicated set of stories that we decided not to include in the book. I mean, we had some Northern Irish, but it's such a different story with Ireland. But Wales had a lower proportion than England. Scotland, much higher than Wales, but not as high as England. In England, it was the southeastern London and the northwest conurbations were particularly strongly represented. The sort of areas with skilled industrial workers or with economic issues and problems that people might have wanted to get away from tended to come more from the cities than the countryside. So, yeah, there's some variation there. And interestingly, the Welsh and the Scottish occasionally got labelled as POMs, but they tended to be very resistant, particularly when the 10 Pound Pom label became sometimes used in derogatory terms, whinging POMs, when the British migrants began to complain about the migrant hostels, or when Australian Conservatives began to complain about the British disease in trade unions and that it was British migrant radical trade unionists that were screwing up the Australian labour movement. So 10 Pound Poms, particularly the whinging pom notion, became quite derogatory. And the Scots and the Welsh, particularly the Scots, who didn't really like being lumped in with the English, often said, well, I'm not a 10 Pound Pom, I'm not a Pommy, I'm Scottish, and made that really clear.
But as I was explaining, I mean, you're a pomegranate, you're an immigrant. So pom actually was just a word for immigrant. So they
technically, but yes. In Australian culture,
it was
when it became not just a term of affection or a nickname, but a derogatory term, the Scots used that as a reason to distinguish themselves from the English.
Were there more men than women that came out, or was it a pretty even mix?
It's pretty even. It's families, it's young singles, it's single women as well as single men. Particularly the young singles, it's really interesting. They're coming for different reasons that say something about gender expectations in Britain in the post-war years, in that when you ask young single men why they came, it was all about economic opportunity and getting a job. You ask young single women who came out in the 40s, 50s and 60s, it was about adventure. Now, it may also have been about getting a job, but that wasn't such an easy thing for a young woman to say in the 40s and 50s. So Joan Pickett, who was a Manchester woman who I emigrated, and she was a bright working class daughter of a train driver, grammar school girl who always wanted to work for the BBC, but coming from a working class family, no way of realising
she didn't have the right accent.
Didn't have the right accent. So Dad got her a job in the typing pool in the railways, and she ended up being medical secretary. She goes to Australia, and, you know, the way she tells the story is all about, this is an adventure. I was able to travel the world, et cetera, et cetera. You actually realise that for her, what she does, and when she reflects back on it later, she realises actually the 10 Pound Passage was the only way I could achieve something that was impossible in British culture and society. I could go out and get jobs that were beyond what would have been imagined. She actually does end up working for the ABC in Adelaide, and she works as an executive secretary on Ocean Island in the Pacific with the British Phosphate Corporation. She has this extraordinary career, and she ends up coming back to Britain after her dad dies and has a professional career. So, you know, for young women, it was an extraordinary opportunity to break away from family expectations, to carve out a new life in a new country, not to necessarily transcend gender expectations, but to do things that would not have been easy or possible back in Britain.
What were the advertising campaigns like that the Australian government used? I know there was a documentary on the 10 Pound Poms that Stan did, I think, and it has some of the clips which, you know, I mean, anyway, they're 1950s, so
they're fun. I mean, they're wonderful.
They're pretty funny, but you know, there's a lot of sort of stereotypes that are a bit of a clanger in 2025, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few kangaroos and things, but it's a beautiful climate. It's about jobs, it's beaches, it's about your own home.
Everyone's in bathers, I noticed.
They're in togs, they're barbecuing. It's great. And I have to say that when the British migrants who'd come on the 10 Pound scheme and hadn't been supported by family members and who ended up in the migrant hostels, and the migrant hostels were pretty basic, Nissen huts and so on, they were pretty pissed off that none of the adverts showed Nissen huts.
No, they showed Bondi.
Yeah, exactly. So they were pretty annoyed, and they were justifiably annoyed, because one of the biggest difference for the migrants, if you came out with a bit of capital, then it was pretty easy, and almost certainly you would have got a job quickly because work was easy to find. But if you had a bit of capital and a job, then you could pretty quickly get out of rented accommodation and buy your own place. If you came without capital and you had kids, and particularly if you had a large family of kids, then it was harder for the woman to work and harder to save money. You're paying rent in the hostel. And so working class migrants without capital often got locked into the migrant hostels for a long period of time. And they hated it and they wanted to get out, even though the hostel did have advantages because it provided if you like, an informal type of childcare that made it easier for women to do paid work. And the rate of British migrant women, married mothers working, was much higher than Australian mothers, as it was true for all migrant women. So, you know, if you had one or one and a half or even two incomes, then that also would enable you to get out of the hostel. So there were a range of economic factors, but having capital when you come to a new country makes a big difference in getting started. And it took a long time, even with secure work, if you didn't have that capital to get yourself out of the hostel, to get a home of your own and to really get started.
So, Alistair, that journey, so that you pay your £10 for assisted passage, you get on a ship and then you're popped into a migrant hostel. Was there a certain set of restrictions on this journey and your 2 years in the country?
There was a whole range of things. There was vetting. There was vetting for health. So if you had TB or other things, then you probably wouldn't get. If you were over 45, unless you were a grandparent or something, but there was an age limit. The White Australia policy applied, and so if you were Anglo-Indian, for example, living in Britain, that was looked askance, and some got to Australia through the £10 scheme and others were rejected. So there was vetting. You had to be interviewed by Australian immigration officials. I did hear one story of someone who was Anglo-Indian and they were quite light, but one of their children, the baby, was quite dark and they covered up the baby in the cot when they went to the interview just to try and conceal race.
And that worked?
It worked. They got here.
Yeah.
So there was vetting. The vetting probably became less and less careful as Australia's need for people, and particularly for Britons, got greater and greater because the British never provide the number of migrants that Australia wanted, and so hence Australia began to look further afield for migrants. But they kept on wanting Britain as their first preference, hence the Bring Out of Britain scheme that starts in the 50s is a way of boosting British migration alongside non-English speaking migrants. So you vetted to come out, but increasingly, if you want to go, you could go. There was no requirement to have capital apart from the £10 for the fare. You're then on a ship until the late 60s when they begin to fly them out as well, and it's a month's voyage, which for most British migrants, particularly working-class migrants, was pretty extraordinary. It was like a month of holiday, being well-fed, getting meat, a lot of fruit, swimming pools, etc., etc.
I've seen the photos. They all look very happy on their deck chairs.
Yeah, until you speak to migrant mothers who had small kids for whom it was a bloody nightmare trying to wash nappies and stop your kids falling over the edge, etc., etc., or being seasick. So that was variable, but on the whole, you know, these are British people who'd never had an overseas holiday, and suddenly they're on this luxury. Well, the early ships weren't, they were converted troop ships, so they were pretty rough, but increasingly they got better quality shipping. So by the 60s, if you were on the Canberra coming to Australia, it was pretty nice. Different to those in the late 60s and early 70s who flew, because that was a long flight over several days, stopping off at all the different airports of the empire, and a sort of much more knackering thing because you're getting jet lag and the exhaustion of flying, whereas you came by ship, actually on the whole, you're pretty healthy and relaxed and not jet lagged when you arrived. But yeah, then if you had your own capital or if you'd been sponsored by family or work, if that was the case, then they'd provide housing for you. If you didn't have that and you were regarded as a Commonwealth migrant, then you were offered accommodation by the Commonwealth, which is mostly in migrant hostels.
Mm. And so would you get your own room in a migrant hostel or were you in a dorm?
Well, most of the singles didn't go into migrant hostels. They were expected that if you were single, you could quickly get a job and pay rent and have your own place. So it's mainly families, and usually a family would have a Nissan hut either to themselves, or a Nissan hut would be divided in the middle and there'd be family at one end and another family at the other end, depending on how big the Nissan huts were. So you had your own sleeping accommodation, which was pretty rudimentary and very hot in summer and very cold in winter. And then there would be shared kitchens, dining rooms, laundries, bathrooms. The migrants hated the bathrooms, which were often filthy. But, you know, not all British migrants ended up in hostels, but the British migrants who ended up in hostels were the ones who made the most noise and who heard, you know, the whinging pom expression really mostly comes.
And that's where you get the whinging pom expression developing because of, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there were rent strikes in migrant hostels by British, not just British, by other migrants as well. There were complaints about food, about conditions, and so on. And the migrants who went back to Britain had often been in hostels and had not been able to get out and get their own home. And, you know, they complained about the conditions which weren't like the advertising. It was, the Australian government's advertising was, if not false, it was pretty misleading about what you might expect if you didn't have a lot of capital and you were in a migrant hostel for a few years. Yeah, not great, but it's worth bearing in mind that there's a housing crisis in Australia in the 40s and early 50s, and a lot of Australians are struggling to get housing and are living with their families in cramped accommodation. But if you'd been in Britain and you had your own home and then suddenly you're in a Nissan hut out in the middle of nowhere, you could see why people complained.
Was the feedback from your oral history that it was in the majority a negative experience at the beginning, or was this just really depending on if you came out as a family group, that's where it became really hard?
It made a big difference. If you're a single migrant, mostly it was a pretty exciting experience. Yeah. If you're a family with capital, then it was pretty positive. If you're a family without capital and a lot of kids, then it was probably pretty tough to start with. So, yeah, those sort of things made a difference. If you were sponsored by family or by employers, it was a lot easier. So there are a range of mostly economic factors that made a difference. And then all the personal idiosyncratic things about character and family dynamics and relationships. You know, some migrant families fall apart under the pressures, or as migrant women get excited and take up the opportunities for work, husbands get jealous, older men. It's really interesting that at the time of the whinging Poms and the migrants returning to Britain and the arguments about hostels, most of the press blamed homesick women. They basically said this is mostly British mums who are homesick for their mums and struggling to raise kids and et cetera, et cetera. And yes, there was a bit of that. It was, you know, as anyone knows who's got small kids, it's easier if you've got extended family to help out. But if you're in a hospital, you had some bit of support. But on the whole, a lot of migrant mums went and found work and were able to do things that they hadn't been able to do in Britain. And it was really interesting. It wasn't usually called homesickness, but we really found in the interviews that there was a fairly significant cohort of older men, family men who were in their 40s, maybe late 30s, early 40s, who'd had jobs in Britain, who struggled to adapt to new working conditions. Maybe their qualifications, they didn't quite come at the same level, or they had to break into a trade where they'd been established in Britain. They really struggled. They struggled with adapting to work, and they struggled because suddenly their wives were working and more independent, and they often put pressures on their wives and families to go back. There's one case, a family, the Cave family, where he was desperate to go home and she was having a great time and the kids were loving it, and he just put his foot down and said, we need to go back. I want to go back and see my mum. I'm not enjoying it here. And the family was devastated. And in the end, the oldest daughter, who was 17, stayed on. And so the family was split. And it wasn't a homesick mum. The mum was having a great time, had a career in Australia that she could never have imagined in Britain. But her husband was desperately unhappy and had the power to take them back.
Yeah, and they stayed back permanently then. They didn't.
They did, yeah. No, well, the daughter stayed in Australia until, actually, it's a story. I mean, you know, if you've been a migrant, that migration never ends. There's always the prospect of going back and so on. And the Cave family, Phyllis and her husband and the younger children went back. Heather stayed in Australia until quite recently. Heather went back to England to be with her mum. So, you know, it's
amazing.
Once you've got family on two sides of the world, there are always falls.
Well, my family is a very good example of that. My mother migrates to Australia, meets my father and migrates to Australia in the 70s. And then they have 4 children. I am the only one who lives in Australia. 3 of them live in England. So
yeah, I mean, when I went to England to study in 1983, I was only going for a year. My mum's driving me to Canberra Airport, and I remember going around one of those interminable roundabouts in Canberra, and she said to me, just don't meet someone and get married and stay there. And, of course, that's always the risk. Young singles, you meet someone and you stay, and once you've got kids in different countries, it's, multi-generational migrant families are complicated things and never entirely settled, and having all the advantages of having a foot in different countries and cultures, but also some of the emotional and personal.
We often hear about the experience of European migrants to Australia, you know, derogatory comments, the term wogs, although, you know, obviously the British get Poms, and the racism that European migrants did experience in the 50s and 60s. But we don't really hear much about the experiences of these invisible British migrants, of course. So what were the attitudes of Australians to the British migrants? Was it very different from the attitudes they had to the European migrants, or actually in the end it was the same kind of sort of low-level racism?
No, I think it was different. I think the racism against Italians, Greeks, and then Asian migrants and so on is Australian racism was pretty powerful. And, you know, if you listen to the oral histories of Greek Australians, Italian Australians, Turkish Australians, that's a really significant part of their stories, managing racism in schools and in workplaces and so on.
Yeah.
Nothing like that degree, and it doesn't have the impacts in terms of opportunities for the British. And some British migrants who we interviewed felt nothing negative. They just felt like they were embraced and they loved it and so on. But others didn't like being told you're whinging when you're complaining for reasonable reasons and then being called whinging poms. So, yeah, but it was rarely as significant a factor as to be the main reason you'd want to go back to Britain. It was rarely a factor that would stop you getting a job or mean that you might lose a job. So for the British in Australia, it's more about the discomfort of trying to make a home in a new place that feels familiar but is different.
Was there pushback in the Australian population to British migration ever? I mean, obviously the government is working really hard to assimilate, integrate the European migrants into Australian society, and they have the, national citizenship conventions, the good neighbour movement of the 50s, all of these about really saying, these new Australians are going to be like us and act like us, and they're going to speak English and work and contribute, and they'll adopt all our sort of sporting culture, all our social mores. But with British, it probably wasn't quite so obvious.
I don't think there's the pushback that maybe, for example, with Vietnamese boat people coming in the 70s, the sort of Asians out sort of stuff. There's nothing like that. And certainly at a popular level amongst Australians. Australians on the whole recognise that migration was good for Australia. And they recognise, or they, for the most part, being British speaking and of British origins themselves, felt most comfortable with British migrants. There's some rumblings in the press when the return rate becomes obvious and when the British migrants are complaining and they're favoured in a range of ways. And so the press is saying, well, why are these English migrants who get it easy complaining, whereas the Greeks and Italians are being much more stoic? Although, to be honest, if you look at the history of Bonagilla, there were Greek and Italian and other migrants who were pretty cross and pretty angry as well.
But I guess it was also, though, what you had to return to. So, the situation in Greece and Italy was so much worse, I guess, than the situation in Britain.
Going back was hard to imagine, but I don't think there's never a groundswell of feeling, we should stop these British coming. Yeah, there's never that. There's some rumblings of concern about the British whinging, but never to the extent of it threatening the scheme. And when the scheme ends in the 70s, it ends in the context, or several contexts. It ends in the context of the end of White Australia and a complete shift in how migration is managed in Australia. It ends in the context of the oil crisis and the collapse of the Australian economy, where we really don't need workers in the same sort of way that we did, or rather there are the trade union movement, and a lot of Australians are wary of migrants coming in when the unemployment rate's increasing. And it ends, I guess, by then Australia has become a multicultural country and Britain has joined the European community, and so those old cultural links are less strong. So the context for the end of the 10 Pound Poms scheme in the mid-70s is very, very different from its beginnings in the late 1940s.
Yeah.
But there's never at any point a sense, we should stop these British coming. And so the British continue to be, even after the end of the White Australia policy and even after the 10 Pound passage, the British continue to be for a number of years the single most numerically dominant country of origin, until there's a point, I think, where the New Zealanders take over and then eventually Indians and Chinese, and I don't know who it is now, but the Brits.
I think it's the Indians. Yeah.
But the British numbers are always very high, and their occasion, just recently I heard I can't remember which Australian government was advertising for policemen and women in Britain to boost the force. So there are still efforts to get Britons to Australia, and certainly if you live in Britain and you mix amongst ordinary British people and they hear an Australian accent, they often talk about their relatives in Australia and they often think, maybe that'd be a nice place to go. And so, there are still a lot of British people who want to come to Australia.
So it's interesting, Alistair. There was obviously the 25% of British migrants who were returning and then half of them actually come back to Australia. But this sort of idea that Australia's not quite Britain in the sun, beautiful beaches, barbecues, lovely houses, cars, plentiful meat and fruit. It wasn't quite that paradise. I mean, did Australia's reputation among Britons suffer, do you think, during this period?
I'm not sure. I think what was more significant was the British economic conditions changed. So in the 1940s, coming to Australia, migrants are struck by two things. Two visceral sensory things when they first arrive in the 40s and 50s. One is about the quality of the light and heat, and the other is meat. And if you come from rationed England in the 1940s, it's a huge contrast. By the 1960s, the British economy is picking up. Jobs are, it's comparatively doing well. And then you've got, certainly in London and the South, the so-called swinging 60s taking up. For a new generation, there are all sorts of attractions about Britain. So if you're coming to Australia in the late 60s, it's a very different context from coming in the late 40s.
And you have, of course, then the Australians, the sort of intelligentsia going over the Clive James, the Jermaine Greer, the Barry Humphries going the other way and saying Australia is actually culturally a bit uninteresting, so I'm going to try London.
And you do get British migrants who come to Australia and think, well, it's pretty ordinary intellectually, or we've still, if you're out in the country, we've still got these wood chip heaters to get the hot water going and an outdoor dunny and things like that. And whereas, we had a plumb system in Manchester. So the contrast will depend upon what type of conditions you've come from. A tenement in Glasgow compared to a 3-bedroom home in the south of England on a suburban estate, that's going to make a difference. In Australia, you end up in a remote country town with fairly limited facilities as opposed to a middle-class suburb in Melbourne. So it depends on where you're coming from, where you go to, and it makes a difference what period of time. There's such a difference between the late 40s and the late 60s in both countries. That it's a very different dynamic.
Yeah. Oh, well, Alistair Thomson, thank you so much for coming on Afternoon Light and talking about the 10 Pound Poms. And I think it's been really enlightening and a reminder that these were migrants who really fundamental to Australia, built really modern Australia, and we probably haven't given them the credit they deserve. They have been really invisible, and it's nice to be reminded that John Farnham and Jimmy Barnes were also part of that.
Among many, many others.
Many others.
Oh, crikey, he was one as well, or she was one as well. Yeah, it's quite amazing. Look, thanks for having me. It's been great.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.